Marilyn Monroe owned almost nothing. Despite earning millions of dollars over her career, despite being one of the most famous women in the world, she lived simply. No jewelry collection, no designer wardrobe kept for posterity, no cars or art or investments. She spent money on other people, on psychiatric treatment, on helping friends who were struggling. But there was one thing, one single luxury item that Marilyn Monroe bought for herself and treasured above everything else. A white baby grand piano. And here's the heartbreaking part. She couldn't play it. Never learned. Never took lessons. That piano sat in every home she lived in. This beautiful instrument that produced no music. This symbol of something Marilyn desperately wanted, but could never quite have. A home. And when she died, alone in her bedroom in August 1962, that white piano was in the next room, silent as it had always been, the only witness to how a woman who had everything actually had nothing at all. It was 1954, and Marilyn Monroe was at the height of her fame. She'd just finished The 7-Year Itch with the iconic subway grate scene that would become one of the most famous images in cinema history. She was making more money than she'd ever imagined possible as a child in foster care, and she was miserable. Living in hotels and rented apartments, never staying anywhere long enough to make it feel like home. She'd gone from foster home to foster home as a child, never allowed to unpack completely, always temporary, always waiting to be moved again. And now, as an adult, as a star, she was still living that way. No roots, no permanence, no place that was truly hers. She was walking past a furniture store in New York when she saw it. A white baby grand piano in the window. It was elegant and sophisticated and beautiful. Everything Marilyn wanted to be. Everything she was trying to become. The white lacquer gleamed under the showroom lights. The curves were perfect. It looked like something that belonged in a real home, the kind of home she'd seen in movies, the kind of home she'd never had. And something in Marilyn's chest tightened. She wanted that piano, not because she could play it, not because she needed it, but because it represented everything she'd been chasing her entire life: permanence, sophistication, home. She walked into the store. The salesman recognized her immediately. Everyone recognized Marilyn Monroe in 1954. He started his pitch, talking about the craftsmanship, the sound quality, the investment value. But Marilyn wasn't listening. She was standing next to the piano, running her hand over the smooth white surface, and all she could think was, this is what belonging feels like. This is what having a home means. You have a piano. You have something beautiful that serves no purpose except to exist, to make a space feel like more than just walls and furniture. The salesman asked if she played. Marilyn admitted she didn't. He looked confused for a moment. Why would someone buy a baby grand piano if they couldn't play? But he recovered quickly, launching into explanations about how pianos appreciate in value, how they're excellent investments, how she could always learn someday. Marilyn let him talk. She wasn't buying an investment. She was buying a dream. She was buying every movie she'd ever watched where families gathered around pianos, every Christmas scene with carolers and music, every image of domestic happiness that included this instrument she'd never had access to as a child. He offered to show her some easier models, upright pianos that were more practical, less expensive, better for beginners. But Marilyn shook her head. It had to be this one, the white baby grand, because it wasn't about practicality. It was never about the music. It was about creating the image of home she'd been dreaming about since childhood. In her mind, a real home had a piano. And now, finally, after years of temporary rooms and borrowed spaces, she could have one. She bought it, paid cash, had it delivered to her apartment. And when it arrived, when the movers carefully positioned it in her living room, Marilyn stood looking at it with tears in her eyes. She'd done it. She'd bought herself a home. Not just an apartment. Anyone could rent an apartment. But a home. A place with a piano. A place that looked like the homes in the movies she'd watched as a lonely child in foster care, dreaming of a different life. But here's the thing about symbols. They can't actually give you what they represent. That piano didn't make Marilyn's apartment a home any more than her fame made her feel loved. It was beautiful. It was exactly what she wanted, and it was completely useless to her because she had no idea how to play it. She'd sit on the bench sometimes, pressing random keys, but it wasn't music. It was just noise. The piano was a prop in the life she was trying to create, and like so many things in Marilyn's life, it looked perfect from the outside while meaning nothing on the inside. Friends who visited her noticed the piano immediately. It dominated the living room, this gleaming white instrument that seemed too elegant for the space. They'd ask if Marilyn played. She'd laugh, a little embarrassed, and say, "No, not really. Maybe someday she'd take lessons." But she never did. The piano was never about playing. It was about looking at something beautiful in her own home and feeling like maybe, finally, she belonged somewhere. Wait until you hear what happened when Marilyn moved. Because she moved a lot. Different apartments, different houses, different coasts. And every single time, that white piano went with her. Moving companies hated it. Pianos are difficult, expensive to transport, easy to damage. But Marilyn insisted. The piano came. It didn't matter if the new place was temporary, if she was only staying a few months. The piano came. Because without the piano, it wasn't home. It was just another temporary space. Another foster home for an adult who'd never learned that home is something you create internally, not something you buy and move from place to place. The moving experience itself became a ritual Marilyn performed with each transition. She'd supervise personally, watching as movers wrapped the piano in blankets, secured it with straps, lifted it carefully onto the truck. She'd follow the truck to the new location, anxious the entire drive, worried about damage. And at the new place, she'd stand in the empty room, directing exactly where the piano should go. Not against a wall, not in a corner. Always prominent, always visible, always the first thing positioned in a new space, as if establishing the piano first would somehow make everything else fall into place around it. The movers thought she was eccentric, a movie star fussing over a piano she couldn't play. But for Marilyn, these moves were about more than furniture logistics. Each time the piano made it safely to a new location, it proved that something could survive the transition intact. If the piano could move and remain itself, maybe she could too. Maybe this time, in this new place, she'd finally feel permanent. The piano never broke during any move. Marilyn did, every single time. In 1956, when Marilyn married Arthur Miller and moved to Connecticut, the piano came. Arthur, the intellectual playwright, must have found it strange. A piano his wife couldn't play, taking up space in their farmhouse. But he never said anything. The piano stayed. And Marilyn would occasionally sit on the bench, looking at the keys, running her fingers over them gently like she was touching something sacred. Not playing. Never playing. Just being near it. This symbol of the home she wanted her marriage to create. Each time the piano moved with Arthur, it became a witness to their marriage's slow dissolution. In Connecticut, it sat in the farmhouse living room while Arthur wrote in his study, and Marilyn struggled with insomnia in the bedroom. The piano heard their arguments, their silences, the sound of Marilyn crying behind closed doors. It was there when Arthur's mother visited and made Marilyn feel inadequate. It was there when Marilyn read Arthur's diary and discovered he'd written that living with her was disappointing. The piano, silent as always, absorbed all of it, the hope of the early days, the growing distance, the final collapse. The piano moved back to California when the marriage fell apart. It moved to her new apartment. It moved to her final house on 5th Helena Drive in Brentwood, the house Marilyn bought in 1962, the first and only property she ever owned. That house was supposed to be different. It was hers. Not rented. Not borrowed. Actually hers. And the first thing she did was make sure the white piano had a place in the living room. Finally, a permanent home for the piano. Finally, a permanent home for Marilyn. The house on 5th Helena Drive was modest by Hollywood standards. A small Spanish-style home in Brentwood, nothing like the mansions her fame might have afforded. But Marilyn loved it because it was hers. She'd never owned property before. Always rented, always temporary. And the first piece of furniture she positioned was the piano. Not in a corner. Not hidden away. In the living room, visible from the entrance, the first thing visitors would see. This is a real home, the piano's placement seemed to say. This is permanent. This is where I finally belong. But even as the piano gleamed in its designated spot, even as Marilyn hung curtains and planted flowers, the feeling of temporary never quite left. The piano was home. The house was home. But Marilyn herself felt like a visitor, waiting for someone to tell her it was time to move on. But here's what makes the piano story so heartbreaking. Even in a house she owned, even with a piano she loved, Marilyn couldn't escape the feeling of temporary. She'd lived in foster care too long, been moved too many times. The fear of being uprooted, of losing everything, of being told this isn't really yours, it never went away. The piano sat in her living room, beautiful and useless and silent. And Marilyn sat in her bedroom, taking pills to sleep and pills to wake up, still feeling like she was waiting to be moved to the next place, still feeling like she didn't really belong anywhere. People who knew Marilyn in those final months said she'd talk about the piano sometimes. She'd mention wanting to learn to play. She'd say maybe she'd take lessons after she finished her next film, after things settled down, after she felt less anxious and overwhelmed. But there was always something in the way. Always another crisis, another pill, another sleepless night. The piano stayed silent, and Marilyn stayed lonely. And the beautiful white instrument that was supposed to make her feel at home just reminded her of all the things she'd bought and all the ways they failed to fill the emptiness inside. There's something particularly sad about the image of Marilyn Monroe alone in that house with a piano she couldn't play. It's the perfect metaphor for her entire life, surrounded by beauty, by luxury, by things people dream of having, but completely unable to access any of it in a meaningful way. The piano could make music. Marilyn could have learned to play, but the gap between potential and reality was too wide. The fear, the insecurity, the trauma from childhood, it all got in the way. So the piano stayed silent and Marilyn stayed lonely. And the house that was supposed to be home felt as temporary as every foster home she'd ever been placed in. The night Marilyn died, August 4th, 1962, that piano was 20 feet away. In the living room, gleaming white and silent while Marilyn lay in her bedroom, alone, overdosed on barbiturates. The piano had been her companion through every move, every marriage, every attempt to create a home. And in the end, it witnessed her death. This beautiful thing that had promised belonging, but delivered nothing except its own silent presence. Had she walked past it that night? Had she paused, maybe, put her hand on it one last time before going to bed? Did she think about all the times she'd sat at that bench, pressing keys randomly, hoping that somehow the piano would work its magic and make her feel like she finally belonged somewhere? We'll never know. But the piano was there, silent witness to the final hours of a woman who'd bought it hoping it would save her, hoping it would turn temporary spaces into permanent homes, hoping it would be the thing that finally made her feel like she'd arrived. The last thing the piano heard was silence, no music, no conversation, just the quiet of a woman dying alone in the next room, 20 feet away but unreachable. When the police and coroner arrived that night, they walked past the piano. Later, when journalists and photographers were allowed into the house, they photographed the piano. It became famous in its own right, Marilyn Monroe's white piano. People saw it in pictures and imagined Marilyn sitting at it, playing beautiful music, living a glamorous life. Nobody mentioned that Marilyn couldn't play. Nobody talked about how the piano was just an expensive piece of furniture that represented a dream she could never quite achieve. The narrative became tragic star, beautiful home, elegant piano. Not traumatized woman, rented life, symbolic object that failed to provide what she needed. After Marilyn's death, that piano was sold at auction. Like everything else she owned, it became a commodity, a piece of Marilyn Monroe memorabilia for wealthy collectors. Someone bought the piano, someone who probably could play, who probably thought they were buying a piece of history, a connection to an icon. And maybe they were, but what they were really buying was Marilyn's loneliness in physical form. That piano represented every time she tried to make a space feel like home and failed. Every time she moved and brought the piano with her, hoping this time would be different. Every time she sat on the bench and pressed keys randomly, wishing she could make music but having no idea how. The story of the white piano reveals something about Marilyn that gets lost in the narrative of the tragic sex symbol. She was trying. Constantly, desperately trying to create a life that felt real, that felt stable, that felt like home. She bought the piano because in her mind, homes had pianos. She moved it everywhere because she thought if she could just keep that one symbol of home with her, maybe eventually one of these places would start to feel permanent. She never learned to play because learning would have meant admitting the piano wasn't actually making her feel at home. And she couldn't bear to admit that. There's a particular cruelty in buying something that's supposed to fix your life and discovering it doesn't work. Marilyn bought the piano thinking it would make her feel less temporary, less like the foster child who never belonged anywhere. And when it didn't, when the piano was just a piece of furniture, when the apartment was still just an apartment, when the loneliness was still overwhelming, she couldn't get rid of it. Getting rid of it would mean admitting defeat. So the piano stayed, moved from place to place. A beautiful, expensive reminder of everything Marilyn wanted and couldn't have. What makes the piano story even sadder is thinking about what Marilyn could have done instead. That money could have gone to therapy, to addressing the trauma that made her feel so untethered. It could have gone to addiction treatment, to getting help with the pills. It could have gone to building real connections with people instead of buying objects that symbolized connection. But Marilyn didn't know how to do those things. She knew how to buy things. She knew how to try to build a home out of physical objects because that was easier than doing the internal work of figuring out why nowhere felt like home. And here's the thing. A lot of people do this. They buy the right furniture, the right decorations, the right symbols of adult stability, and wonder why their space still doesn't feel like home. Because home isn't about objects. It's about feeling safe, feeling permanent, feeling like you belong. And you can't buy that? Marilyn Monroe had a white baby grand piano, but she never had a home. She had apartments and houses and spaces filled with things, but she never had the internal sense of belonging that makes a place feel permanent. The piano also reveals Marilyn's aesthetic sensibility. She chose white. Not the traditional black grand piano. Not wood. White. It was unconventional, striking, beautiful. It matched her aesthetic. The platinum blonde hair, the white dresses, the brightness she cultivated. The piano was an extension of her carefully created image. Even in this one personal luxury, she was thinking about how it looked, how it fit into the Marilyn Monroe persona she'd constructed. Norma Jean might have bought an upright piano in oak. Marilyn Monroe bought a white baby grand. The choice was deliberate, artistic, and sad, because it meant even her most personal possession was partially for show. But there were private moments, too. Friends reported seeing Marilyn sitting at the piano late at night, not trying to play, just sitting there with her hands resting on the keys. In those moments, the piano was exactly what she needed it to be, a beautiful, silent companion. It didn't judge her. It didn't ask anything of her. It didn't require her to be Marilyn Monroe, sex symbol, movie star, public figure. It just existed, solid and permanent and beautiful, the only thing in her life that wasn't complicated or demanding or conditional. These late-night piano sessions became almost meditative for Marilyn. She'd sit there in the dark or near dark, sometimes for hours, not moving, not playing, just being. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the things she couldn't say, all the feelings she couldn't process, all the pain she couldn't articulate. The piano absorbed it all without judgment. It never told her she was being too sensitive, too difficult, too much. It never complained about her tardiness or her pill use or her inability to memorize lines. The piano just existed, solid and beautiful and unconditionally present. In those moments, Marilyn wasn't performing. She wasn't Marilyn Monroe's sex symbol. She was Norma Jean, sitting next to the one thing in her life that asked nothing of her except proximity. Maybe that's why she never learned to play. Playing would have required something from her. Sitting beside it in silence required nothing. And God, she was so tired of people requiring things from her. There's a photograph of Marilyn sitting at the piano in her final home. She's wearing casual clothes, no makeup, hair down. She looks tired but peaceful. Her hands are on the keys, but she's not playing. She's just sitting there, present with this object that had traveled with her through every phase of her adult life. And looking at that photograph, you can see what the piano really meant. It was her constant. In a life of chaos and change and instability, the piano was the one thing that came with her everywhere. It was her anchor, even if it was an anchor that couldn't stop her from drifting. The fact that Marilyn never learned to play also says something about her relationship with potential versus reality. The piano represented potential to make music, to have a home, to be settled and stable. But actualizing that potential would have required work, practice, commitment, vulnerability. It would have meant failing repeatedly, sounding bad, struggling through the learning process. Marilyn had spent her entire life performing perfection. She couldn't allow herself to be bad at something, even in private. So the piano stayed unplayed, this perfect symbol that never had to be tested against reality. In her final weeks, Marilyn talked to friends about redecorating, about making the house on 5th Helena Drive truly hers, about taking piano lessons finally, learning to play, making music in her own home. She was talking about the future like she believed she had one. And the piano was part of those plans, still symbolizing what her life could be if she could just get through this rough patch, if she could just feel better, if she could just sleep without pills and wake up without dread. The piano was hope. Useless, expensive, beautiful hope. When Marilyn died, the piano became something else entirely, evidence of her loneliness, proof of her inability to create the life she wanted, a monument to dreams deferred and then abandoned. But also, strangely, it became proof that she tried. She bought that piano because she believed in the possibility of home. She moved it everywhere because she refused to give up on that dream. She kept it even when it was impractical, even when it took up too much space, even when it reminded her of her failures. She kept it because giving it up would have meant giving up entirely, and Marilyn Monroe never quite did that. She fought until the very end for something, anything that felt like belonging. The white piano sits in someone's home now. Maybe they play it. Maybe it finally makes music after decades of silence. Or maybe it's still just a beautiful object, admired but not used, symbolic but not functional. Either way, it survived Marilyn Monroe. It outlasted her life, her fame, her struggles. It's still white, still gleaming, still elegant. And somewhere in its wood and strings and keys is the ghost of a woman who wanted so badly to feel at home that she bought a piano she couldn't play, hoping that having it would be enough. It wasn't. But God, she tried. The piano's survival feels almost cruel in retrospect. It exists in someone's collection now, probably valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars, not for its musical quality, but for who owned it. Marilyn Monroe's piano is worth more than any amount of music it could have produced. The woman is gone, but the symbol remains, still silent, still beautiful, still representing everything she wanted but never achieved. Collectors can own the piano, but they can't own what it meant. They can't feel the weight of all those nights Marilyn sat beside it, hoping proximity to beauty would make her feel beautiful, hoping ownership of home symbols would make her feel at home. The piano keeps its secrets. And maybe that's fitting. Marilyn kept hers too. There's a lesson in the white piano story, though it's not a comforting one. You can't buy your way into feeling whole. You can't purchase belonging. You can't furnish your way out of childhood trauma. Marilyn Monroe could afford a white baby grand piano, but she couldn't afford the therapy and time and safety she would have needed to actually heal. The piano was easier. The piano was concrete. The piano could be delivered and placed and admired. Healing couldn't. So Marilyn bought the piano and moved it from place to place and sat with it in silence and hoped that somehow, eventually, it would work its magic and make her feel like she finally had a home. And it never did. Because pianos don't do that. People do. Connection does. Safety does. Healing does. But Marilyn never quite figured that out. In the end, Marilyn Monroe's white piano is one of the saddest objects in Hollywood history. It's not dramatic like a suicide note or mysterious like the circumstances of her death. It's just a piano, beautiful, expensive, useless to its owner. But it tells the whole story in miniature. A woman who had everything money could buy and nothing money couldn't. A woman who desperately wanted to belong somewhere and tried to create belonging through objects. A woman who understood symbols but couldn't access the reality underneath them. A woman who bought a piano hoping it would make her feel at home, and instead it became another witness to her loneliness. Another beautiful thing in a life full of beautiful things that didn't add up to happiness. The white piano didn't save Marilyn Monroe. It couldn't teach her to feel permanent when her childhood had taught her everything was temporary. It couldn't give her a home when home is an internal state, not a physical space. It couldn't fill the emptiness left by years of being unwanted, unloved, used. The piano was just a piano, beautiful and white and silent. And Marilyn was just Marilyn, broken and talented and desperate for something she couldn't name and definitely couldn't buy. They existed together in houses that never quite became homes, in spaces that remained temporary even when they were technically permanent, in a life that ended long before the piano stopped being beautiful. And that's the tragedy of the white piano. It outlasted her. It survived her. It still exists somewhere, probably still gleaming, probably still beautiful. While Marilyn Monroe is gone, reduced to photographs and films and stories, the piano was supposed to be the symbol of her permanence, proof that she'd finally found somewhere to belong. Instead, it became proof of the opposite, that Marilyn Monroe was always temporary, always transient, always searching for home and never quite finding it, no matter how many pianos she bought or houses she lived in or people she loved. The piano is still here. Marilyn is not. And somehow, that reversal, the object surviving the woman, is the perfect ending to a story that was always about trying to find permanence in a life that felt eternally temporary. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. What objects do you own that symbolize something you're searching for? Can possessions ever fill emotional needs? What would you have told Marilyn about finding home? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more deep dives into the symbols behind the icon, the loneliness behind the fame, and the truth about what we really need to feel at home. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.